Chapter 18. Referring to the center of town as the University District could be taken as either a compliment or a pejorative, depending on the context. It was true the area housed a row of financially out-of-reach buildings where the city's educational elite made their homes. This wasn't limited to university staff. It included the superintendent of public schools, 2 deans from the city's prestigious religious high schools, and 2/3 of the local school board. Many wealthy alumni and financial supporters also lived within walking distance of campus. The remaining homes were occupied by physicians, medical specialists, star academics, and, of course, the compound of the Adherents. By contrast, when locals referred to living out east, it was almost always meant as an insult, especially by those in the University District. That insult had roots in a decades-long rivalry between the city's 2 wealthiest areas, both vying for control of local funding and political influence. The Eastern District was home to 4 major international banks, and most of the affluent bankers lived within 5 minutes of their firms. Several prominent law firms were also located there, including 2 known nationwide for extracting massive settlements. Subdivisions had cropped up nearby, allowing attorneys to avoid the city's steep commuter tax, a tax, incidentally, almost unanimously supported by residents of the University District. Over the years, political battles, especially over the commuter tax, had hardened the rivalry between the 2 districts into something personal. A small group of residents were known as the Lucky Few, locals who had bought homes in the East long before the 4 banking institutions moved in. Most of these houses dated back to the 1970s, with plywood walls and overstuffed carpet that had once passed for luxury. Many had been renovated by the time the bankers arrived, but a few remained untouched, widely regarded as eyesores. Wealthier newcomers sometimes called them splinters, annoying, stubborn, and hard to remove. As the original owners passed away, their closest relatives often inherited the homes and moved in, making it nearly impossible for the banks to buy and demolish them. The Haidt family lived in one of those splinter houses. Gerald Haidt's father had been a school teacher, and raising a family in that part of town had never been easy. His own father, Gerald's grandfather, was an auto mechanic who had bought the house as a retirement escape from the inner city. When he died at 62, he left the home to his son, who gratefully moved in with his wife and their infant child. That child was named Gerald Haidt, a name he had answered to for most of his life. But everything changed when he encountered the Adherents. After that, he called himself Summer Wind. His parents had refused to use the name, and for years their defiance had infuriated him. Now, in light of everything that had happened, it almost seemed laughable. He would never call himself Summer Wind again. From this point forward, he was only Gerald Haidt. The looks on their now elderly faces when their prodigal son returned home at 6 a.m, broken and bruised, were enough to bury Summer Wind forever. The moment felt eerily close to the parable in Luke. Gerald had expected them to let him in, but he'd also feared their shame and disappointment might lead to rejection, maybe after a long, bitter shouting match. It was shameful, really, how deeply he had misjudged them. The door opened. His father stood there in a tattered brown bathrobe he'd owned since Gerald's childhood, its original belt long replaced with a black tie from another robe. One pocket held the television remote, the other, his glasses. "Good heavens, what happened to you, son?" his father cried. Gerald, nearly unrecognizable, collapsed into his father's arms and wept. It felt surreal to look skyward as his father, now joined by his mother, pulled him into the house and onto the living room couch. His broken face faded into slumber as the 2 hovered over their only child. He hated seeing them cry. He felt like he had always been the source of all their misery, and now he was only confirming that suspicion. It was terrible, and worse was yet to come. He convinced his parents not to contact the police. Detective Weber was a fiend, one who terrified Gerald. Besides, he already had an exit plan. He had an aunt, his mother's sister, who lived several counties away with her 3rd husband, far from home and hopefully off the Adherents' radar. With any luck, they wouldn't come looking for him there, and his aunt would agree to shelter him until things blew over. Her husband, known to Gerald as Uncle Wowsow, kept a small arsenal, enough to strike fear into any adherent foolish enough to follow. Still, Gerald doubted it would come to that. He imagined they were injured in the car crash, too battered to make a move before he disappeared. They wouldn't dare bother his parents. They'd know the Haidts would go straight to the police, and that wasn't the kind of attention the Adherents wanted. The real problem was Detective Weber. He'd see this as an attempt to flee, and maybe it was. But what choice did Gerald have? Gerald's parents carried on as if nothing had happened. Both went to work each morning, carefully maintaining appearances. They told no one, no co-workers, no colleagues, about their battered son nursing his wounds at home. For his part, Gerald slept most of the day, waking only to eat the takeout his father brought home. At night, he slept just as deeply, the kind of unbroken, restorative sleep that felt almost indulgent given the circumstances. The next day, the charade continued. His parents went to work and Gerald played the part of a layabout, aimlessly drifting through the hours. It was almost funny how the circle had come full turn. He now sat at home like he had as a teenager, munching on snacks and fooling around on his old computer. And he had to admit, it was fun playing the old games again. Yet, unbeknownst to Gerald, nefarious eyes were constantly on the house. 2 vehicles circled the block again and again, never staying in one place for long. In charge of the surveillance was a disfigured man in a neck brace, barking quiet instructions through radios and encrypted messaging apps. There were as many as 6 of them in total. What they planned to do when they found him was anyone's guess. But one thing was certain, it would be the end of Summer Wind, the end of Gerald Haidt, the end of whoever he thought he was. By early afternoon, there was still no sign of life inside the house. The prowlers had seen Gerald's parents leave early that morning, and neither had returned by lunchtime. The mail had been delivered, but no one retrieved it. 2 missionaries had even knocked, tucked a pamphlet behind the screen door, and walked away unanswered. With nothing to report, the prowlers began convincing themselves Haidt hadn't taken refuge here after all. They were just about ready to call it off when something moved. The prowlers had been warned. Gerald Haidt wasn't the only one being hunted. The police were watching too, and the Adherents knew better than to openly challenge secular authority, especially in a place like the United States. Going toe-to-toe with law enforcement was suicide. When forced to interact, the Adherents cooperated. When possible, they vanished. Staying off the radar had always been the unspoken rule. Now more than ever, that rule mattered. Gerald Haidt had been arrested less than a week earlier by a man who, in their circles, had already earned a nickname, the Brazen Bull. There were whispers from within. Some wanted Detective Weber to disappear. Thankfully, those names never reached Cardinal Wen. When he approved the surveillance of Haidt's family home, it was with one goal: tie up loose ends quietly and walk away like none of it ever happened. That was how the Adherents survived. And then there was a second party looking for Haidt. No names, no affiliations, just fragments. What was known is that there were at least 2 of them. Middle-aged, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed, they traveled in a sleek black luxury SUV and carried themselves with quiet authority. They didn't move like journalists, and they didn't feel like law enforcement. If they were with the government, they weren't wearing the usual mask. They weren't exactly direct either. A few days earlier, they showed up at the compound asking questions, probing, unsettling ones. That was the first time Cardinal Wen saw them in person. They were turned away, of course. But the fact that they showed up at all was enough to put the entire inner circle on edge. Later, a woman, an inquirer from one of the outlying groups, claimed to have spoken with them. She was the first to float the idea that they might be journalists, but no one was sure. And that uncertainty was what made them dangerous. When the prowlers saw the black SUV pull up, their hearts nearly stopped. It was the same vehicle, the one from the compound. It eased to a halt along the sidewalk in front of the house they'd been watching for days. From a distance, the prowlers watched as the 2 men stepped out, slow and deliberate. There were many prowlers stationed nearby, but even in numbers they felt outmatched. The driver wore a blazer, his shirt pulled tight across a rounded gut. He looked almost casual, businesslike even. But his posture, his stride, the way he scanned the house without hesitation, it all said the same thing. This was a man who could end a fight before it started. Even a stray blow from him would drop most to their knees. The passenger was shorter, but worse, quietly terrifying. Despite the chill in the autumn air, he wore only jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His face was hidden beneath a long, meticulously trimmed beard. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. The passenger walked with an assured gait towards the front door. His posture was perfect and upright. Both men exuded confidence. Their enormous frames followed one another to the single step before the screen door. The passenger knocked with his left hand and stepped back to await being greeted. Even at that distance, the prowlers noticed that he gritted his teeth as though he was in pain and was visibly massaging his left hand with his right. The prowlers watched as the two waited for a moment before the passenger tried a second time, this time with his right. With no sign of activity, the driver opened the screen door and knocked on the wooden front door in an attempt to summon someone. The passenger noticed the falling pamphlet left by the missionaries earlier that day. He examined it before shrugging. The driver glanced both ways down the street, then tried the front door. It didn't budge. He let the screen door ease shut behind him and turned back to the passenger with a shrug. As he stepped down the walkway toward the sidewalk, the passenger gave it one more try, knocking again, calling out to whoever might be inside. The driver cupped his hands around his eyes and peered up at the second-story windows. Still, no answer. No movement. Another shrug. He backed away, and the two exchanged a few quick words before climbing back into the SUV. They sat there for a while, making calls, the engine off. Then the prowlers heard it roar to life. The SUV pulled away. It happened completely by accident. The prowlers hadn't planned for it, hadn't even discussed a contingency. As the black SUV rolled past, the driver locked eyes with one of them, seated behind the wheel of one of their two surveillance cars. The driver smirked. He nudged the passenger and pointed openly at the car full of watchers. The prowler froze. A chill passed through him. There was something in the man's eyes, his build, his posture, his calm, that radiated dominance. He wasn't just confident. He was evolved, outclassing everyone in the car by an order of magnitude. The prowler's mouth hung open as the SUV passed. It stopped at the end of the block just a few feet ahead. The right blinker clicked on. There was a pause. Then the SUV turned and disappeared from view. The prowlers waited for another half hour before giving up on their surveillance. The mother was the first to arrive home with takeout in hand. As she exited her car, she slung her oversized purse over one shoulder and retrieved 2 plastic bags from the passenger side seat with her other free hand. The plastic bag was filled with 2 visible foam containers that were bulging at the seams. Napkins and plastic silverware spilled out of the top of the bag, only held in place by the tight quarters that they were surrounded by. The prowlers watched as she fumbled around with her bag momentarily before retrieving a pair of keys. She opened the door and disappeared from sight. The father pulled up soon thereafter. While Haidt's father was exiting his car, one of the prowl cars sluggishly pulled by. The occupants examined the father closely as he fumbled around with a shoulder bag of his own. They pulled away and never saw him enter. Blocks away from the Haidt home, Sides and Eckhart were eating Cantonese cuisine in a local place called Bamboo Treasure. Eckhart was a fanatic for their pork dumplings ever since he first tried them in his youth. Sides went for an old favorite, General Tso's chicken. Eckhart was a fan of hot tea. Sides was a fan of iced. Eckhart loved to use chopsticks. Sides preferred to use a fork. It was quite humorous, actually. There in Bamboo Treasure, 2 giant American men were each trying to navigate the generous portion sizes, each with his own ideas about how Cantonese cuisine should be eaten. Sides giggled to himself each time Eckhart's enormous hand reached across the table to pour hot tea in the tiniest of cups. He was probably unaware that he occasionally raised his pinky as he gulped down the hot liquid. For nearly an hour, the two discussed the case in detail. They speculated that Haidt's parents either knew where he was or were hiding him somewhere in the house. It was Sides who first suggested simply asking the Haidts directly, explaining the situation and hoping for honesty. Eckhart was skeptical at first, but as Sides laid out his reasoning over dinner, he began to come around. Haidt, Sides argued, was their best chance at understanding what really happened to Alfonso Silva. Whatever tied him to the Adherents was serious enough to leverage. And after his run-in with Detective Weber, Haidt was likely terrified, and rightfully so. That fear might make him open to new allies. The prowlers were closing in, even if they hadn't found him yet. It was only a matter of time before Haidt had to run or got caught. It was just after 8 when Sides asked for the check. He excused himself to the restroom before it arrived. Soft, ambient music drifted from the ceiling speakers as he relieved himself. Aimless piano runs that sounded like someone vaguely aware of accidentals, but with no real plan. A woman sang in a language Sides didn't recognize, something trans-Himalayan maybe. His eyes wandered to the yellow tile lining the wall beside the urinal. Some featured tiny fish, hand-painted or printed. One tile stood out, a brighter yellow, fishless and clearly newer. A replacement, Sides figured. Probably some drunk had cracked the original, and this was the closest the owners could find. Sides shook himself dry, flushed the urinal, and zipped up. At the sink, he pressed the soap dispenser 3 times before a blob of pink liquid finally oozed from the nozzle. As he scrubbed, he kept one eye on the narrow door beside him, half expecting it to swing open and slam into his hip. He rinsed, turned off the water, and reached for the paper towels. They were folded haphazardly on top of the tin dispenser instead of inside it. He grabbed a handful, dried his hands, and used one to open the door. Back at the table, Eckhart was finishing the last of the hot tea and sliding his wallet into his front pocket. Sides frowned. Eckhart had already paid. "Thanks," Sides said. "No problem." The 2 men exited the restaurant with full bellies as they crossed over into the cool autumn air. It was more than refreshing, and Eckhart even exaggerated a massive inhale through his mouth, as though he was cooling his insides after all the hot tea. He unlocked the doors, and Sides hopped in. Eckhart walked to the driver's side and entered the SUV. He turned the ignition and immediately changed the gear to reverse. Without so much as a discussion, Eckhart reversed the SUV and turned to the direction of the Haidts' home. They said nothing to each other in the brief moments that passed while Eckhart drove to their destination. It was 8:30 when Eckhart turned the SUV off, and the 2 sat in silence. They watched the house in silence. The screen door was shut, but the wooden front door stood wide open, letting cold air spill inside. A faint yellowish glow lit the interior, though they couldn't make out its source. Flashes from a television flickered across the far wall. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At 15, the screen door creaked open, and Mr. Haidt stepped out holding a bulging trash bag at arm's length. He gripped it awkwardly, keeping it about a half-foot from his chest as he shuffled across the walkway. Sides noticed him moving in a strange, hopping rhythm, then spotted the water dripping from the bottom of the bag. Haidt was trying to avoid soaking his jeans. Sides gave Eckhart a gentle tap on the shoulder. "Time to go." They slipped from their spot just as Mr. Haidt reached the garbage can and hurled the bag inside. Despite their quiet approach, the old man flinched when he noticed them, startled, even if though it was unintentional. "Dear God," he shouted, grabbing his chest. "You trying to give me a heart attack? I'm 67 years old. Who the hell are you?" "I'm Brian," Eckhart said, offering his hand. "Richard," Sides said definitively. Mr. Haidt rubbed his right hand against his shirt before finally offering it to Eckhart. At the last second, he recoiled and jerked it back. They looked at one another awkwardly for a moment, as Mr. Haidt took a deep appraisal at the 2 giant figures standing over him. They were almost cornering him against the side of his garage. At the slightest bit of trouble, they could pin him against the door, and he wouldn't be able to fight them off. "I'm sorry, Brian. Richard, I've got garbage water all over my hand. You understand?" Mr. Haidt said while continuing to rub his hand against his shirt. The 2 figures glanced at one another before Mr. Haidt began to speak again. "Say, you 2 aren't law enforcement, are you?" "I was," Sides said. "You was? As in, was earlier this evening or no longer am?" "I was, but that was a long time ago," Sides said. "I see," Mr. Haidt said. "And what about you, big fella?" "No, sir. I'm an attorney. Well, was an attorney. As in, no longer am." "I see." "Well, what the hell do you want?" Mr. Haidt said. "We'd like to talk to Gerald," Sides said. "Okay, you found him. What do you want to say?" Mr. Haidt said. The 2 men looked confused for a moment. They glanced at one another, waiting on the other to break the silence. "I said you found him, buddy. What's the problem?" Did I give you a F 20 years ago? Wait a minute, Eckhart said. Wait a minute? I've been waiting 5 for you two knuckleheads to make some sense. Now, what do you want? What kind of idiots approach a man at 9 o'clock at night in the dark? You know what? Don't answer that, Mr. Haidt said. The two stood frozen, dumbfounded, paralyzed. No words came. Mr. Haidt lingered there with them, the silence stretching into what felt like an eternity. His arms were outstretched, a mix of confusion and expectation written in the gesture. Another moment passed. Then, at last, he spoke. His voice louder now, almost impatient. What do you want? I don't think, Eckhart said, shaking his head. I don't think you're who we're looking for. Sides finished? You said you're looking for Gerald Haidt. That's me, Mr. Haidt said. The two men stepped back, nearly scoffing at how wrong they'd been. Eckhart shoved his hands into his pockets, a quiet gesture of resignation. He glanced up and down the street, while Sides kept his eyes on Mr. Haidt. Just as Eckhart began to reset his posture, something caught his eye. A figure in the second-story window, peering down at them. He only saw him for a second, but it was enough. It was Gerald Haidt. Their eyes met, and in an instant, the man upstairs vanished from view. That's the Gerald we're looking for, right there, Eckhart said, pointing toward the second floor. There were sounds of slamming doors and a frantic commotion coming from inside the house. Before the senior Gerald Haidt could react, Eckhart was already moving towards the screen door. He screamed out for his partner to help. Sides abandoned the senior in favor of helping his comrade. Eckhart locked eyes with the junior Gerald Haidt just as he came frantically down the stairs, trying desperately to reach the front door before Eckhart could enter. This was to no avail, for Eckhart had already cleared the screen door and was now blocking the entryway with his enormous frame. His hands were raised in a non-threatening manner to calm the situation. It went unnoticed. Fearing the end, the junior Gerald Haidt let out a terrified scream.